Hello and welcome to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMagan, a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and with me today is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we're back, and this time we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court and the upcoming nomination for it, and whether we should really care all that much. Maybe, just maybe, what we've been told about the Supreme Court really isn't quite accurate, and maybe we're putting a little bit too much faith in this institution and counting on it as a very, very important part of the federal government. And Tho, who's worked in Washington, he'll offer a little bit more commentary from giving us an insider's view. And Tho, right now, the new nominee is Amy Coney Barrett. And what should we think of her? Is she a pretty good nominee from our perspective? That is, she isn't as bad as she could be. What do you think?
I think one of the things that's really interesting is that she is not an Ivy League, has an Ivy League background. That's a problem, I think, that exists not only within the judiciary, but the Fed. You get a lot of groupthink from people coming from common institutions. She's from Notre Dame. By all accounts, she's a very skilled legal mind with a large background both in academia, and she was confirmed a few years ago for another federal appointee. So she has a record of being confirmed by the Senate, which I think made her attractive in this sped-up process. In terms of her judicial philosophy, the name that's thrown out there as a comparison most often is Scalia. Scalia had many rulings that we would find egregious. Tom Woods and Kevin Getzman's Who Killed the Constitution. I know that they pick out several in there that are deserving of scrutiny, but I think Scalia is considered one of the better, relative to a lot of some of the members of the Supreme Court of late. Again, it's what's your benchmark there, though? So that is what you're kind of looking at there. And obviously, this is something that I think movement conservatives had been hoping for. She had kind of gotten this sort of her own little following as being the RBG replacement for a while. It was clear from the beginning that Trump wanted a woman to fill this position. So I think that this was definitely a pick that appeased the base. And obviously, that the strong Catholic background there for some of the cultural and social issues is obviously something that Trump is kind of leaning into going into an election cycle. Though the question there is, how much this, can this backfire by motivating some others? But we shall see.
Yeah, I think what you don't want is someone who's basically a clone maybe of Clarence Thomas. And because while Scalia was often good on civil liberties things and police state things, not always, but often, Thomas was usually bad on those things. Thomas never seemed to meet a pro-police state issue that he didn't side with the state on. In terms of searches and seizures and that sort of thing. And so we have to remember the larger context here. Everybody's so obsessed with leftist social policy and all that right now. But keep in mind what happened in the 20 years prior to that. We're still saddled with a lot of the stuff about privacy and TSA and anti-terrorist stuff that we got under the Bush administration, which met the approval of a lot of so-called conservative judges who were on the court. And they really helped save a lot of that. That was one of the places where RBG was actually good, was a lot on that civil rights stuff. So, yeah, I don't want like a Kavanaugh or another Justice Thomas on there. Someone who's maybe more like Gorsuch, or like Scalia, not like Kavanaugh. That's probably the best you can hope for from a Republican president.
And she does have some good quotes out there. Again, quotes taken for what it's worth, but she's talked about a judge who likes every result that she reaches is not a very good judge. I think a lot of this is important, just kind of building up that again, the big concern is that she's going to impose theocracy onto America, which, you always have to have a hyperbolic boogeyman dealing with any modern political issue. But she's also stressed that, people who are not religious still have deeply held moral convictions. And so, you have, your framework and look at the world. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not. There's going to be a moral, ethical framework that you're evaluating from. And I think that that's one of the things, again, it's the announcement was made a few weeks ago now. We've gone through several news cycles because of how crazy the modern world is, particularly in 2020. But this was the major issue, concern a few weeks ago, is that, a lot of people on the left freaking out and going way overboard in their attacks on, anybody that held a Christian viewpoint. So, when we see hearings kind of arise, whether that comes back up in the forefront, I think is going to be something interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think that she seems, and I know that she's also had a very good record on gun rights, which is one of the issues where the court has actually played a very valuable role in recent years in kind of pushing back on kind of a trend that was infringing upon that issue. So that's something else that, I mean, she even went to the extent, I think, defending the rights of felons to own a gun, which I think is a pretty strong defense of what we consider natural law in that regard, which is very promising.
Yeah, most of my criticisms of what I've seen by her would be that she's just too mainstream on stuff and not libertarian enough, obviously. And so that would mean then that most of the criticisms leveled against her, like she's a theocrat. I mean, obvious nonsense, not going to happen, not really a threat to anybody. And I haven't heard from the mainstream media or the left any criticisms that are actually valid, although there's certainly reasons to criticize her. Now, nevertheless, we're being told that Trump should wait until after the election to appoint this judge. And that seems like a weird thing. I mean, the Constitution is pretty straightforward, that if you're president, you get to appoint judges. And assuming he doesn't die in the meantime, Trump is going to be president until January. And he could appoint a judge with Senate confirmation. The sitting Senate that's currently sitting, because the new Senate won't be sworn in until January either, at any time. This is quite clear in the Constitution. So why is it that we're supposed to wait?
It's because the Democrats have no other cards to play, right? If you are out-armed, then you try to just kind of delay things and kind of make something up. And so what they're trying to rely upon is a wield hypocrisy, because of the lack of vote on Merrick Garland under, when you had Obama, appointing him after Scalia's death with the Republican Senate. Of course, the difference there is that, Republicans have the votes this time. Obama did not have the votes in the past. And, when you have the votes, you have the power. And the idea that Mitch McConnell or that any politician, any effective political leader is going to allow the opposition to restrain them by wagging their finger and saying hypocrite, I mean, that's a normal day in politics. But so that's the argument, and I think they realize that it's a losing battle. I think everyone expects Cocaine Mitch to whip up the votes, and this is the one thing he does really, really well is pushing through judicial appointments. And this is one of the big advantages that Trump had going in here, not just with Supreme Court, but throughout the federal judiciary, is that you had a lot of open judicial appointments that Harry Reid did not get through. And so Mitch McConnell's team has been taking advantage of that void. But they're going to, the argument would be hypocrisy. It is not going to be particularly effective. And I think that we're going to end up having a Justice Coney Barrett, particularly considering that the fact that, again, when the biggest amount of, the biggest criticism they've mounted has been outrage that she adopted children from Haiti. If that's the best that they can do, they're going to have some problems going forward.
Yes. Well, and of course, there's no real hypocrisy at all, right? The argument wasn't that you just shouldn't appoint a president in the last 6 months or whatever. The argument was the president doesn't have the vote in the Senate, and we don't have to approve a new justice if we don't want to, because we're the Senate. And that's just basic checks and balances sort of thing written in there. The Senate wasn't required to really approve anybody ever. They could stall indefinitely, and they wouldn't be in violation of Article 1 or anything else. And that's, as you say, that's the way it works, right? You have different branches of government and they have power in a certain way to approve or not approve things. It's called a veto of sorts. And so, yeah, I just don't see the problem here. And that brings us to the larger issue, right? Well, you wanted to talk a little bit about if they hadn't done what Harry Reid wanted to do, which was eliminate the the filibuster on this, then the Dems at this point would be in a better position to actually force maybe a more middle of the road judge. They might not have been able to prevent approval in toto, but they would have had more power. But instead they got rid of that. So now all you need is a majority vote.
Right. I mean, and particularly in this environment, like, I mean, it's weird, like looking back and just seeing how some of these votes went down in the past, and you kind of had this, both sides kind of working together philosophy, which in many ways was a big problem with the 20th century, that both sides got along together way too well. But in today's hyperpartisan environment, like, you would not be able to get a judge like Amy Coney Barrett if you still had that 60 vote threshold, and I think that's one of the things that's often missed is, there's a lot of talk about, political acceleration and boiling tensions and things like that. But, just as important, and perhaps more importantly, in the federal level, in the way that the governance is happening in D.C., we're seeing a decay of political norms. These unspoken aspects that, they're of the rule. And, Harry Reid, using the nuclear option on not just federal judicial appointments, which includes the Supreme Court, but also cabinet positions. That's a major change to the way that business is done, and this is continuing. I know we're going to address the conversations about stacking the court. Well, again, like, that is a way of ignoring political norms. The discussion of getting rid of the legislative filibuster entirely, so that you do not need 60 votes in the Senate to get something through. I'm kind of surprised that Mitch McConnell is kind of a traditionalist in this regard. So, like, I'm not too surprised that he didn't bow to that. But I know that's something that Trump really wanted. And I think that's one of the really interesting things here is that Trump, I think, has escalated the Republican side of things, their willingness to combat these political norms. So I think throughout the 20th century, a lot of this came from the left. I mean, FDR, for example, I mean, everything that he did, there's a lot of, he didn't care about political norms when it came to getting through the agenda that he thought was important. But I think Trump has really undercut that sort of conservative, we need to get along sort of mentality. And Newt Gingrich kind of had that too. So I'm not going to say, Trump's really kind of a pioneer here. But that, I think, is one of the lasting impacts that Trump's going to have on the Republican Party, that's accelerating this political environment in ways that, that are not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, if we identify the lack of common ground that is existing with a lot of significant fundamental differences of view amongst Americans, then unity is not a value in that regard. And so I think this is something that makes the current political environment so interesting, and something different than maybe that we would have seen, 80s, 70s, definitely the 90s. And it's something that perhaps deserves a little bit more attention from critics of government.
So for those of us who live outside the Beltway and have never lived there and don't really like those people, we have a certain view of Supreme Court judges. I mean, when a position opens up on the court, what is the feeling in Washington? Is this really an opportunity then to change the ideological leanings of the court? Is it seen more as a partisan thing? What is, from an insider's view, what is the thinking about what is the proper way to appoint new judges to the court?
I really think that, I mean, it is one of the biggest moments that's out there. I mean, like in the way that people want, like they view the judges as like this almost kind of robed nobility, right? Because they're the ones that are supposed to be beyond politics. They're the ones that there's a lot of recognition that the court has a lot of a power in the underlying aspects of what the federal government does. And so it is one of those moments that, and particularly with this weird cult following that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, ended up developing, and really she leaned into it. I mean, like this is, she absolutely loved, this kind of weird pop culture phenomenon that she had with her that I think was really kind of forced I don't know if a lot of people that are not hyper politically active quite felt the same way about her. But it is one of those kind of moments that makes everyone in DC circles stop, and I think that's one of the issues, right? We give far more authority and deference to this body than we should, and obviously was ever kind of originally intended. And no one has had a better PR firm. No institution in America has had a better PR firm working for them than the Supreme Court, outside of maybe our general class.
Well, and of course, some of the awe over the court is warranted because, in a sense, nowadays the way the court does things and has done things since the New Deal, really, is that a ruling for the Supreme Court essentially acts as a constitutional amendment. And you can see the difference if you look at the political history of, say, the 1920s and the 19-teens. If you wanted any significant change to the political status quo, it was recognized you needed a constitutional amendment. So there were all sorts of amendments circulating in the teens and 20s, amendments about child labor, of course, amendments about alcohol, which was passed, of course, with prohibition, then later repealed, partly because it was recognized that the only way you could get the feds to start regulating alcohol was to have a constitutional amendment. It was only a few decades later that we decided, no, you don't need a constitutional amendment, just have the Supreme Court rule on it. And that is something that fundamentally changed after mid-century, probably really after FDR, where we don't need a constitutional amendment to federalize abortion. We just have the court say that it's now a federal issue. We don't need a constitutional amendment to say that the federal government can regulate marijuana. We'll just have the Supreme Court say that it's fine. Now, there are some earlier examples, like the court and the presidency and Congress all kind of agreed together in the late 19th century that immigration regulation was now a federal issue. And but of course, then the court started to back that up. Prior to that, the courts had taken the position that the states could regulate it and that it was primarily a state issue. Naturalization, being totally separate, was what the feds had purview over. Now, of course, anti-immigration people don't like to hear that, but sorry, the fact is it's not a federal issue in the Constitution at all. The courts just like on Roe v. Wade did in about face and say, oh, this is a federal issue now, and that's a lot of power that the court can wield. However, at the same time, it seems the court's able to get away with this stuff to a large extent because we've created this whole mythology around it that the Supreme Court is filled with these deep thinkers and they're non-political and they get the case before them and they sit down and they think real hard about what the proper ruling is, and then they issue it and everyone says, that is what the Constitution really says, I guess, or that's the right answer, whatever that means. Of course, there is no right answer in political issues like this, and I think they've managed to get away with that for a very long time. And even though the court, in many cases, has been packed with people who are explicitly politicians, a perfect case in point being Earl Warren, who was just a regular old politician. He ran for president. He threw his support behind Eisenhower in 1952. And what a crazy coincidence. He got appointed to the Supreme Court a little while later. Yeah, but this idea that he suddenly went from just regular old politician to deep thinker who was unswayed by political ideologies is obviously nonsense, but it seems to hold a lot of cachet with people.
Well, not to get too conspiratorial, but I think a lot of the reason why this mythology has been allowed to build up is because the Supreme Court has tended to go along with the federal government more often than not on all this major stuff, right? They a lot of their major actions, I think, have tended to be striking down state laws and things like that. Obviously, the most obvious one in recent history was the Obama, giving their stamp of approval on Obamacare, with some very, very sketchy judicial logic there. But if the Supreme Court had been an active spur, an active sore and a pain in the side of the federal agenda, I think that there would be a lot more hostility there, at the expense of their respect within Washington circles. And I think that's one of the big concerns that's out there beyond simply, losing a big blue piece for a new red piece from team dynamics. There's a lot of concern that, a Justice Coney Barrett could end up being a threat to Obamacare, could be a threat to some of the legislation that's come out from the federal level. And I think that's definitely something that is baking into why they see this as such a great threat.
Well, that's an excellent and very important point, is the court does not like to be humiliated. They don't want to hand down a ruling that they don't think is going to be actually enforced. So very rarely, if ever, I can't think of really any example, except maybe for the case where the court declared Andrew Jackson's Indian removal scheme to be unconstitutional, and the president just ignored him. And that was humiliating for the court, and they don't like to do that thing. So the court's usually only going to rule in the sort of way where they're pretty sure that at least one of the other branches of government is going to have their back, whether the presidency or Congress. So there's going to be some sort of significant group within the federal government that's going to agree with the court and help the court ensure that their ruling is actually enforced. You very seldom do you see the court actually pick a fight that it may not be able to win. So, I mean, it's just simply not going against the zeitgeist in Washington, hardly ever. If it makes some revolutionary ruling, it's because it thinks it can count on some other powers in Washington to have its back. And it's not this thing out there acting on its own, separate from the political pressures in D.C. It knows very well what's going on in D.C., what the current environment is, and what it thinks it can get away with.
The idea that Justice Roberts is independent from politics, I think it's a lot of wishful thinking there.
Yeah, people aren't nearly cynical enough about the Supreme Court. And I don't know why people act like cynicism is some bad thing, because it's not. So when you're thinking about the court, you're thinking about the Fed, you're thinking about all these technocrats out there who are making decisions in the shadows. You should probably be a lot more cynical than you are. And this brings us to the issue then of court packing. And this has come up. It came up during the debate. The question was, for Biden, will you pack the court when you're president? Because now these dastardly Republicans, they're going to have, in some cases, really, kind of a 6-seat majority on the court. And so what are you going to do about that? Because that's not allowed, apparently. And he wouldn't answer whether he was willing to pack the court or not. Now, packing the court, it's totally constitutional. All it requires is a change in statute. Certainly no amendment is required. And all it means is you change the size of the Supreme Court. And the court has varied in size over the centuries. There was no carved in stone edict handed down from the Almighty that the court shall have 9 people on it. You could even have an even numbered people, whatever. And so why shouldn't Biden pack the court? I know that the court itself is generally opposed to packing because the court doesn't want to have a whole lot of judges. They don't want their status quo screwed up. Also, if the Senate, of course, starts adding a bunch of people, or if Congress starts adding a bunch of people to the court, it will then be much harder to deny that the court is essentially a political institution, right? Because, oh, look, we'll just add a few judges until we get the majority that we want. And it's fine. Let's just do that. And then another party comes in and maybe they'll add some more judges. And so then that makes it more clear to everybody that this is a political institution that Congress manipulates in order to get the rulings it wants. Now, in the long term, that actually strikes me as maybe not a terrible idea. In fact, I've suggested in the past, I've even written articles saying we should pack the Supreme Court because, to really expose the fact that the court is a highly political institution, and also to really reflect the fact that it's silly and nonsensical to think that 9 people could represent the interests of 325 million Americans and rewrite the Constitution in such a way that they claim represents those people. All the way up to, I said, hey, maybe we should even do a thing where there's 50 Supreme Court judges, and we all agree that every state gets their own Supreme Court judge. Yeah, why not? That's I don't see why that would be any morally superior to the current system we have now, where we just kind of, by the way, the majority on the court is usually overwhelmingly DC judges. There's very little representation from the rest of the country outside the East Coast. Trump would be really changing the face of the court by adding some people from the Midwest and the West. Gorsuch being from the West. Most of these guys are all like New England, Washington, D.C. people. So why not have a bunch more judges representing other parts of the country? And this whole thing goes back to FDR as a political tactic. Goes back to FDR, who wasn't getting the decisions he wanted from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court kept striking down a lot of his New Deal legislation under involving Justice Owen Roberts, who then famously switched his vote and started ruling in favor of Roosevelt's preferred legislation. This is called the switch in time that saved 9. I know that historians now debate whether Roberts really changed his position all that much, but certainly it continues to be a sizable group of scholars who accept that, yeah, Roberts really did change at least his vote some of the time in order to prevent FDR from following through on his court packing scheme. And you can even go back to 1937's Fireside Chat, where FDR talks about the court packing scheme. He invents this totally silly and absurd notion that the 3 branches of the federal government are all horses. They're a 3-horse team, and they all need to be pulling together and moving in exactly the same direction. And the Supreme Court isn't doing what the president and the Congress are doing, so therefore we need to change the makeup of the Supreme Court so the court starts agreeing with Congress and the presidency. This is, of course, the exact opposite of how the whole branch of government scheme is supposed to work. They're supposed to cancel each other out. But I guess the Rubes in 1930 found that sort of thing convincing. But he wasn't able to follow through on it. The judge, the Supreme Court decided, oh, yeah, well, maybe we can play along with FDR because we don't want a bunch of new judges on here. And ever since then, has been kind of verboten to do that. But what's your opinion on court packing?
Wait, I have to give you credit. Not only have you been writing about it, but this was before it was cool, right? Like before the left was getting on board with it. Because this was during the Obama years, where if you had brought up court packing through to most of the people that worship West Wing and listen to Pod Save America, they would have thought that you were a crazy person. But so you had been out there before this became a mainstream idea on the left. Again, I think that if one of the biggest mistakes that out there would be trying to fix the federal government, right? The idea that all we need is a legitimate, a well-respected federal government that just abides by good old American classical liberal ideas, and that's the solution to all the problems. No, that's never going to happen. It's a wishful thing, and so I think anything that highlights the how much of a joke these structures are. These are not. The federal government as it exists today is not about defending your natural rights or your constitutional rights or anything like that. It's there to impose its will on the rest of the United States. And I think that something like court packing, I think, would be just the next great escalation of this destruction of these political norms that has been so important in creating this facade of a noble federal government. And what would be interesting to see is the reaction to that. I think that I think normal people would. I don't fault normal people for not picking up on the importance of changing a 60-vote rule to a 50-vote rule on judicial nominees. I think once you start seeing more people in robes, that's a visual that I think people kind of pick up on, and that's what I'm interested to see. Again, if you have a Biden presidency and a Justice Amy Coney Barrett, I think this is one of those issues that immediately brings into this divide between Joe Biden-style Democrats and the new left Democrats in terms of how far they're willing to go with the numbers that they have. Because you still have, just the same way that Mitch McConnell is at heart a Senate romantic. And that's why he hasn't gone after the filibuster. There's something there where they still have this very romantic picture of what that body is. I think Joe Biden, I mean, that's just part of being in there for 40 plus years, is they kind of have like these romantic rose-tinted glasses on these things. And I think that he would really have to kind of, I think that he would be against that. Now, how much power a Joe Biden president would actually have within the modern Democratic Party is a separate question. I tend to think that not much, particularly given his strong personality these days. But a President Kamala Harris, I think would probably be a lot more open to that. But I think that this is a topic that's not going away, and the fact that it's become mainstream, I think, is a reflection of where Washington really is, and why the idea that you still have so many people that think that if you remove Trump, we're going to return to the golden days of the Obama administration, or even perhaps more delusionally that 90s West Wing nostalgic sort of time. And it's like, obviously that's not going to happen. The bridges from both sides, there's no going back to that. I think for a variety of different reasons. And again, I think court packing it's not going away, and I think that's going to be kind of the next frontier in terms of people recognizing that what's happening in Washington is not normal, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, the left keeps threatening to quote unquote burn it all down. Now, from the metaphorical side on that, of course, I don't want to physically burn things down, but metaphorically, sure, go ahead and be careful what you wish for, I think is what they would face, because so much of the complacency you get from just regular old mainstream middle class Americans out in other states is that they bought into all these myths about the power of government and being obedient to these important institutions, and if you're not, then chaos reigns and so on. And that's why I think up until really recently, and there are of course still strains in it, especially among the old timers, this idea that, well, whatever the Supreme Court hands down, we got to follow. So if the Supreme Court says that all your guns are illegal now, I know there's those people out there who claim you can pry the gun from my cold dead hands and so on. The behavior I've seen from most conservatives and Republicans leads me to believe they'll just do what they're told. And because the Supreme Court says so, because an institution with an American flag waving over it told them to do it. And as time goes on, though, it seems maybe there's a little less enthusiasm about believing all these things that are handed down. And then at some point, if you start to force the issue, then you've packed the court, you've made it abundantly clear that DC politicians have no interest in representing all those people in flyover country who are deplorables and human garbage and so on. At some point, those people are going to stop believing in all these institutions they were brainwashed in grade school to regard as august and important. And then the Supreme Court starts handing down decisions. Then the feds start handing down laws, and the locals don't follow them. And then what do? You send in U.S. Marshals to force them to follow these rules. That's when things start to get pretty sticky. And given the personnel available in Washington versus the personnel that exists at state and local institutions, not to mention issues of state National Guardsmen maybe being unwilling to fire on their own community members and so on, things might start to get a little more touch and go. But yeah, if the left wants to burn it all down, and with it all those institutions that have been relied upon to actually convince people to follow the rules, then sure, go ahead, because what you're asking for is people to stop listening to what you're saying then in Washington. And so the left would basically be undermining itself by doing that. Now, of course, I don't really disagree with that agenda overall. I do think that those institutions should be undermined. I just don't think they understand what they're doing. Maybe I think they're so thirsty for power that they think it will just be real easy then to force people to do their will through institutions of violence like the military, federal officers, and so on. But things might not work out that way. And we're already seeing lots of people writing, even in mainstream publications like the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Chicago Tribune, left-wing writers saying, well, maybe a split is in our future. Maybe we can't really make a go of it. And maybe what we really do need is at least two new separate countries. And this is shocking that people would say that now. And outside of the usual sources of that opinion. And so I think that does really reflect, I think, a view that a lot of these institutions and the amount of faith people put in them is starting to break down. So we're going to have to leave it at there for this week. Thank you for joining us on Radio Rothbard. And Tho and I hope to be back again in the future, maybe talking a little bit about next time democracy and what we can do to make it less bad, and maybe some of the problems that go into our particular American version of democracy. And so tune in next time. We'll see you then. Thanks.